In future, all babies can be designer babies, that we can replace this grotesque genetic crapshoot as we have today with responsible parenthood, in which all prospective parents choose everything from the hedonic range, hedonic set point, pain thresholds, and yes, though it's a hot button issue, ensure that the intellectual capacities of their offspring are maximized to the full. Essentially, the whole biosphere is programmable. And this is quite a radical idea. If a global consensus existed, which of course there doesn't, it would be possible to defeat suffering within perhaps 100 years or so.
Thank you for joining Change I Am Possible, which is India's first future tech podcast. And today I'm super stoked to have Mr. David Pearce on the show. He's been the co-founder of the World Transhumanist Association, which has been currently rebranded as Humanity Plus Inc. And he's a prominent figure within the transhumanist movement. He's a philosopher, vegan, a writer on transhumanist and ethical subjects, and on advocate of abolitionism. Pearce has answered more than 400 questions on Quora, and his answers have been viewed more than 750,000 times. How cool is that? David, welcome to the show. It's super exciting to have you on the show. Really delighted. So let's start with the small and the easy ones. What is transhumanism and why does it have so much negative connotation in the public domain?
Well, I wish what is transhumanism were an easy question to answer. In fact, the transhumanist movement is very diverse. Very, very crudely, though, transhumanism consists of the three supers: super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness. Let's run through those very briefly. Super intelligence is the idea that we can massively augment our cognitive capacities. Some transhumanists believe that humanity is going to fuse with our machines. Others are worried that actually super intelligent machines may actually take over. But there is another strand of this conception of transhumanism that essentially sees that artificial intelligence is going to massively enrich our own minds, and that indeed humans themselves will rewrite our genetic source code so we can become super intelligent. So that's one strand of transhumanism. Second strand of transhumanism, radical life extension. This is the idea that just as silicon robots can be upgraded and repaired indefinitely, so can organic robots, humans, that there is no biological necessity for humans to grow old and die, that our parts can be upgraded and replaced. But the final strand of transhumanism, and that's the one I am particularly focused on, is abolitionism or super happiness. This is the idea that it is possible to use genetic engineering, information technology, nanotech to get rid of suffering throughout the living world and to replace pain, misery, suffering, malaise, and depression with a new architecture of mind, life based entirely on gradients of intelligent bliss.
I want to dwell a little bit more on the negative connotation, when it comes to transhumanism, because, most of the people are averse of technology and they're scared of these people who are working on cryonics, the people who are working on life extension. There's people who are working on, figuring out a way where we could live forever. There's mind uploading and stuff like that. And do you think that something can be done, maybe a narrative can be created where people could be made to realize that there is nothing evil or something going on here, that whatever transhumanism is maybe thinking or trying to say is that you want to create a better world. But where do you think is the problem?
Yes, well, most people have quite mixed attitudes to technology. I mean, even bioconservatives who hate the idea of transhumanism nonetheless will generally express their views on a computer, perhaps on their mobile phone, wearing clothes and with the trappings of modern civilization. So, although primitives, neo-primitives do exist, most people, it's particular kinds of transhumanism that raise their hackles. And I think one of the reasons is essentially sci-fi and fiction. It just one knows from the sci-fi, the science fiction one has read as a child, or the sci-fi movies that one has seen, that bad things happen with technology. I mean, I'm not doing justice to some of the criticisms of the transhumanist project. All kinds of things can go wrong. I mean, for example, as soon as one starts talking about rewriting the genome, then there is the specter of eugenics and the horrors of 20th century history. So I don't think critics are wrong to warn of the potential pitfalls, but the idea that somehow we should conserve the status quo with all the pain, misery, suffering, stupidity, disease, aging, and death in the world, I find anathema.
With transhumanism, what are the things which are presently helping, like as in whether it's cryonics, genetic editing, what are the technology or the tools which are creating impact right now?
Let's start with cryonics. I see defeating aging as a twin track process. Yes, addressing the biological genetic causes, exploring particular drugs and gene therapies, but I think a lot of people they have very mixed feelings here, because they have this sense that, well, yes, maybe science will find a cure for aging, but the chances are I'll be dead by then. But if you sign up for cryonics, or maybe even consider the possibility of cryoeuthanasia, then in principle, at any rate, it's possible for everyone to share. Now, yeah, I think if people are cryonically suspended in optimal conditions, then you have a fairly good chance of being reanimated with a sufficiently sophisticated technology. I'm not at all clear it's going to be possible to recreate people who are suspended in, sadly, today's imperfect conditions, but with optimal suspension, then so long as the relevant information in your central nervous system is preserved, and perhaps too, if you have a sufficiently rich digital footprint, then it'll be possible for grandchildren or maybe an advanced civilization to reanimate you. Um, Super intelligence, yeah, I mean, one of the first things one needs to do, I think, is to actually explore what do we mean by intelligence. And I think we have a very impoverished conception of what intelligence means. We can enter into that discussion there, if you like. In terms of technologies that will actually defeat suffering, I think one of the most exciting developments has been the development and imminent commercialization of in vitro meat, cultured meat. So essentially, it's going to be possible for people to carry on as now, and we know most people are probably morally apathetic, without harming sentient beings. Other exciting technologies include essentially access to pre-implantation genetic screening and counseling. Sadly, this is most commonly used today for the purposes of gender selection, but there is nothing at all to stop pre-implantation genetic screening and counseling being used to pick everything from pain thresholds to approximate hedonic set points of your future children. One of the other big stories recent years has been designer babies, the first CRISPR babies, and though they were conceived in China in extremely suboptimal, indeed very unfortunate circumstances, I very much hope that in future all babies can be designer babies, that we can replace this grotesque genetic crapshoot as we have today with responsible parenthood, in which all prospective parents choose everything from the hedonic range, hedonic set point, pain thresholds, and yes, though it's a hot button issue, ensure that the intellectual capacities of their offspring are maximized to the full. A lot,
Wow.
a lot more that can be said there.
Well, we will definitely talk about genetically modified babies. So Ray Kurzweil has been taking a lot of these supplements, to for longevity. You have been a transhumanist movement leader. So what are you doing for longevity? Would you like to live forever? Do you see that as a possibility?
Number of issues to explore here. One is the nature of personal identity. I mean, in what sense is one the same person as one's, one's 5-year-old ancestral namesake? I'm not sure technically living forever is possible, but nonetheless, I think it's going to be possible to phase out aging and death. In terms of my own regimen, I do the sensible things, the boring, sensible things: diet, exercise, and sleep discipline. Still absolutely critical. For example, I take selegiline, have done since 1995. It increases lifespan in multiple animal models, modestly improves cognitive performance. No, it hasn't turned me into a psychological, physical Superman and so on, and that the field of anti-aging research awaits truly radical breakthroughs. But I see, even if I don't think I'm personally going to benefit from a program of defeating aging, I see it as an obligation for our society that aging, age-related disease and disorder is a terrible scourge, and it needs to be defeated.
Yeah, I completely double that. I've seen my near loved ones, age and suffer. And I think we are approaching a time, maybe in the next possibly a few decades, where we will be either be able to halt or a reverse aging. And I think that would be so cool. So I'm excited for that. And I just recently I was having a conversation with Dr. Mir Bazala. He's one of the first guys who's working on TAME, which is targeting aging with metformin. And there are so many others who are working on that. So I am really laying my hopes on that we do find a solution where we do not have to suffer, because I think once we age, it's almost like a package you get. The all of these diseases, chronic diseases and stuff like that. And if we can kind of control aging, we will be able to live healthily and a better life. So I'm excited for that. So I was on the Twitter page and it reads that you are interested in the use of biotechnology to abolish suffering throughout the living world. So could you talk about the Abolitionist project?
Yes, it's worth perhaps mentioning that though many people would love to live indefinitely, there are lots of people in the world whose lives are stained by pain, depression, anxiety, misery. They find life drags on too long. And the abolitionist project sounds incredibly grandiose, but it's technically feasible. This is the idea that we can get rid of depression and pain and replace the biology of suffering with life based on gradients, information sensitive gradients of intelligent well-being. And this might sound a bit sci-fi, but just as there are some people today who spend essentially their whole lives below hedonic zero, they are animated by gradients of misery or depression. At the other extreme, there are a handful, small percentage of extremely happy people with a high hedonic set point who are high functioning, and they go through life animated by information-sensitive gradients of well-being. They never get depressed. And we know from, initially it was from twin studies, but now we're going down to the molecular genetic level, that mood, hedonic range, hedonic set point, pain thresholds, pain sensitivity have a very high genetic loading, and that now we have essentially mastery of our genetic source code. It's going to be possible essentially to tweak and eventually rewrite our genomes so that instead of being predisposed to, as many people are, sadly, low mood, anxiety, and all the sort of spectrum of negative emotions, it'll be possible to ratchet up hedonic range and hedonic set points. And the abolitionist project, it isn't just confined to one particular species, Homo sapiens, that a pig, for example, or a cow is as sentient and demonstrably as sapient as a toddler. It will be possible to extend the abolitionist project to the rest of the living world. Perhaps the first priority is simply to shut the death factories. The factory farms and slaughterhouses are the source of perhaps the world's worst form of severe, readily avoidable suffering. So before we start reprogramming the rest of the biosphere, we've got to stop systematically harming non-human animals. But once we do this, and once we replace traditional animal agriculture with cultured meat and animal products, it'll be possible to tweak the genomes of free living non-human animals. Like, once again, using such technologies as CRISPR and much more counterintuitively using technologies such as synthetic gene drives. And yeah, essentially the whole biosphere is programmable. And this is quite a radical idea. If a global consensus existed, which of course there doesn't, it would be possible to defeat suffering within perhaps 100 years or so. In practice, sadly, I think hundreds of years of suffering probably still lie ahead. But yes, when the abolitionist project is complete, there will be no experience below hedonic zero, and life will be animated entirely by gradients of well-being. In terms of our actual hedonic range, transhumans and ultimately posthumans, their hedonic range may be, I don't know, orders of magnitude richer than anything that's physiologically accessible to humans. But that is much more speculative. I think our overriding obligation is to get rid of pain and suffering.
Sounds really awesome that we could get to a world where pain and suffering could be abolished. I mean, how cool would that be? But yes, there is a certain kind of people who say that pain and suffering is part of human existence. But I personally completely do not think so. In fact, I have shoulder injury, which gets so horrible in the night. I mean, I have to twist and turn the entire night, and I understand, and I'm looking forward for a time where the pain could vanish, maybe the help of technology or whatever. I mean, I've done everything that's possible in the healthcare ecosystem right now to kind of, figure a solution, but there's no solution at this point in time. But hopefully we could come to a point where we could abolish pain. This is a minor thing, I think, but then there's this depression. I think that is another spectrum altogether. And if we can eliminate depression, the world would be so cool. We would definitely like. I mean, I would want to talk about that later. But I think you rightfully mentioned that we need to take linear steps if we want to abolish pain and suffering. First, we need to possibly get into the animal model, because globally, I think there's a larger population who eats meat. Whether the global population, and the slaughterhouse, if anybody walks in, I think it's so horrifying that anybody, I mean, a meat eater, if he actually walks in and sees what's going on, and I'm sure that he or she will completely reconsider their eating habits and transform to like possibly vegan or veg. So now you said that getting rid of pain and depression is technically feasible. What would be the approach? Genetic modification? What could you like? I mean, talk
Yeah,
more
I
about
can
that.
unpack this. Hundreds of different genes are implicated in pain processing, but I focus on a handful, and one of them is the SCN9A gene, the so-called volume knob for pain. Now, nonsense mutations of SCN9A abolish pain altogether, but if we were to induce nonsense mutations, we would also abolish nociception. That's the ability to avoid noxious stimuli. And that, for now at least, would be premature. So the first stage, I would say, is to arrange for all prospective parents to be allowed to choose benign versions of SCN9A. Now, the SCN9A gene has dozens of different alleles, genetic variants. Some are associated with abnormally high, others with abnormally low pain sensitivity. And what we want to do is initially is to ratchet up pain tolerance and pain thresholds so that essentially today there are a minority of people, if you've ever met them, they'll say things like, pain, it's just a useful signaling mechanism. They know how they avoid noxious stimuli, but it doesn't dominate their lives. Sadly, of course, there are lots of people at the opposite extreme. And the first stage in tackling the problem of pain, I think, is to ensure that all future children are born with benign versions of SCN9A, so that pain is just a useful signaling mechanism. Now, looking further ahead, yes, it's possible to imagine either using smart prostheses, i.e., a little sensor so that your hand immediately withdraws from the hot stove, presumably with some kind of manual override and so on. But a lot of people, at least not yet, don't want to become cyborgs. So yeah, if we can just get rid of the worst excesses of pain, this will be progress. In terms of something like, okay, let's consider hedonic set points and hedonic range. Unlike pain, one can't point to a single volume knob for how happy or sad is your default hedonic set point. But nonetheless, there are a handful of genes with multiple alleles that we can tweak to ensure that people, new babies are born with higher hedonic set point, ranging from the COMT gene, catechol methyltransferase gene. Another very interesting pair of genes is the so-called far and far out genes. They regulate endogenous anandamide production, anandamide from the Sanskrit to bliss. And it'll be possible to choose benign versions so that prospective children are predisposed, one hopes, to gradients of bliss. One needs to be careful here. There's quite widely reported in the media was the Joe Cameron case. She has two unusual mutations of the far and far out gene, which means that she never gets depressed, never gets anxious, but also she either doesn't feel pain or has an abnormally high pain threshold. And she's a retired Scottish school teacher. She thought she was normal. She didn't realize just how exceptional she was until a doctor pointed out that everyone essentially for this extremely, normally very painful procedure for her hand. Everyone wanted anesthesia, and she just waved it away. Any of your listeners will, well, at least some of your listeners will be thinking, what about the potential risks and pitfalls? And they are legion, because if one is too greedy about eliminating negative states, then people might be more prone to taking risks, risk-taking behavior. But this is complicated because, on the whole, the happiest people love life the most and they're keenest to preserve it. Counterintuitively, it's depressives who often engage in most risky behaviors. They don't take care of themselves, they don't eat properly, exercise, self neglect. So yeah, it's not straightforwardly a matter of happy, pain-free people take more risks. But essentially, yeah, it's not just a matter of tackling the biological genetic basis of suffering. It's also a matter of a cultural, political, social revolution. We need a debate as a society. How much pain and suffering do we want in the world? It's going to essentially be an adjustable parameter.
How we have the choice to choose a partner, we should be given the choice to augment ourselves or take the decisions on either if we are going for gene editing and a responsible gene editing. So I actually feel that we should be, but what, there is this other conversation, like there are people working on capturing the entire cognitive structure and possibly uploading it onto a digital substrate. And this has happened in a very basic way in a nematode, a C. elegans worm back in 2010 odd, I think. Well, because a C. elegans worm is just about 302 odd. Besides C. elegans worm, I think they've done it to another species also, and they uploaded the entire cognitive structure onto a digital substrate, and the digital substrate was behaving exactly like the real one. So in theory, if you could do it to a C. elegans worm, we could eventually, in the far future, where we can completely understand or map out our 86 billion neurons and 100 trillion synapses and the way they fire and wire. And if we can actually capture the data and map it on a digital substrate, do you think that would be a way to eliminate pain altogether? Because I'm vested in virtual reality, I build virtual reality content, and I know that in possibly 50 years or 100 years, we'll be able to create virtual reality worlds which will be indistinguishable from reality. That's going to happen. So do you think that we could create a virtual world with maybe capturing do you think that is that a possibility that, and would it be a way to eliminate pain? And because over there we could just code whatever we want.
Ooh, a lot of issues there. First, yes, I agree that immersive, cross-modally matched virtual reality will be able to enable transhumans, posthumans to live in designer paradises, perhaps with totally different laws of physics, adventure playgrounds, you name it. That's absolutely fantastic. However, number of points. By itself, simply creating a designer paradise doesn't recalibrate the hedonic treadmill, this suite of negative feedback mechanisms in the brain that stops most of us being very happy or very sad for long. So virtual reality, augmented, extended reality technology needs to be approached in harness with genetic biological solutions to upgrade our reward circuitry. You also mentioned the possibility of so-called mind uploading. could so-called destructive mind uploading eliminate the problem of suffering? This is the idea that if one were to scan, digitize, and upload our minds onto a different substrate, digital computers, if it were done destructively, well, that would be one way to get rid of suffering. Some transhumanists believe in this scenario. For various reasons, I'm a skeptic. I do not think that classical digital computers can support phenomenal binding. This is the way in which, even though our nervous systems appear to be 86 billion or so membrane-bound neurons, nonetheless, right now, you are a unified subject of experience. You perceive individual perceptual objects as part of a vast world simulation. And I don't think classical digital computers are going to wake up and become subjects of experience. Sure, they can do a fabulous array of cognitive tasks, but ultimately they're just zombies, perhaps so-called micro-experiential zombies. One needs, if one does believe in digital sentience, one has to explain how a bunch of ones and zeros and logic gates can actually give rise to a unified subject of experience. In that, even if consciousness is fundamental to the world, as some people believe, and it's a hypothesis I take seriously, imagine replacing the ones and zeros of a classical Turing machine with discrete pixels of experience, execute the code. Yeah, the result of the program is the same as before, but all you have is a micro-experiential zombie. Now, if a natural question is, well, how do humans and non-human animals generate perceptual objects, the unity of the self? And I'm happy to explore this issue, though it's extremely controversial. But as I said, I don't see digital computers as a solution to the problem of suffering. Or rather, if we were to attempt destructively to upload our minds to digital computers, well, yes, we'd get rid of suffering, but we'd get rid of subjects of experience too. It's a rather exotic form of existential risk, you might say.
Right. Yeah. So that, I think it goes into a topic which can last forever, because there's no consensus on consciousness. So it can just go on. So go on and on. So you are a vegan, right? So now, through genetic modification, there are some interesting startups around the world who are tinkering with the genomes and building meat, fish, chicken, and even plant-based meat. When do you think, there are companies such as Impossible Burger, Impossible Food? There's quite a lot of startups here in India also who are fronting genetically modified meat. But when do you think, what's the timelines according to you when we will have a genetically modified meat on a dinner table?
One point first, you're absolutely right. It is certainly possible to create a genetically modified artificial meat. However, if we do that, this is likely to scare traditionalists. And one thing about cultured meat is that it's possible to grow lab-grown meat without any form of genetic modification. And I think it's going to be really important in terms of selling the idea of cruelty-free meat, that one stresses that it's natural. This indeed more natural than the products of factory farming. I mean, personally, I'm extremely relaxed about the idea of improving cultured meat, so it is nutritionally enhanced, flavorfully enhanced, and so on. But at least at first, marketing, is going to be critical to tell people it's not genetically altered, it's not a frankenfood. In terms of timescales, the first cruelty-free, lab-grown, factory-grown meat animal products will be entering the supermarkets within the next few years. I think things will then snowball. In that, sure, at first there will be traditionalists, but as soon as media influencers, opinion formers, and the like essentially talk about, adopt these products, use social media probably for signaling purposes. Essentially, I think there will be a very rapid take up, and probably with a great deal of righteous indignation, the majority of the population will insist that then factory farms and slaughterhouses are shut. I mean, just imagine, even if you're, morally apathetic, whether it's on the supermarket or a restaurant, there are two identical products in terms of taste, texture, genetic makeup, price, and so on. One is cruelty-free. The other is traditional from a slaughtered animal. Which item are you going to choose? I mean, what civilized person would really want the deliberate creation of suffering for no purpose? So, in terms of a realistic timescale of getting factory farms and slaughterhouses shut, I would, yeah. I mean, I'm one of life's pessimists temperamentally, but I would see by the middle of the century, I think they will be shut and outlawed internationally. It could be done much sooner. I don't know. I would love to see essentially the acceleration of the development and commercialization of all of these products.
Right. Yeah, I think it should be done much sooner.
Yeah,
Yeah, because we have taken things for granted for too long. Right from our environment to our animals, we don't really care. There's no empathy built in for other living beings. So that's I think it's not right. So earlier in the conversation you mentioned about genetically modified babies, that in the future there should be genetically modified babies. Now recently, I think in, in 2018, or this Chinese geneticist Yang Kui He created the world's first CRISPR babies, but there was a complete outburst. What are your views against that? And do you think we will have genetically modified babies anytime soon?
Yes, I think we will have CRISPR edited babies, but it'll be done in a much more regulated way. Now, the Chinese scientist in question, what he was really trying to do was to create smart babies. The particular mutation, the official reason for his experiment was that the kids would be protected from HIV. But the particular mutation that was being induced, also in so-called animal models, actually leads to superior intellectual performance. This was not a coincidence. He wasn't naive. There were other people involved too. Essentially, the scientist was trying to create smart babies. And I don't think, looking ahead, that the first officially ethically regulated designer babies, the focus is going to be on intelligence. I think it's going to be on eliminating the various nasty genetic diseases, cystic fibrosis, and so forth, that almost everyone recognizes it would be good to get rid of. And indeed, yeah, if you look at public attitudes, essentially most people would favor getting rid of well-known genetic diseases. What they're much more uncomfortable about and in some cases actively hostile to, is the idea of enhancement, of super babies, of creating a race of enhanced superhumans. They're probably thinking of Brave New World, Gattaca, and the like. Now, what I would like to see is recognition that pain, chronic pain syndromes, depression are just as debilitating and just as harmful to quality of life as well-known genetic diseases. And so I think it's one thing that's really worth stressing is that every child born into the world today is a unique, untested genetic experiment. I mean, a lot of parents are kind of hostile or wary of this idea of genetic experimentation and mad scientists. And that, if one does consider it ethically permissible to bring new life and suffering into the world, then I think one has an obligation to try to load the genetic dice in favor of one's kids. And as well as the good stuff, there are going to be missteps, accidents, tragedies, you name it. But this is the price for having children. Now, one can make, I think, an ethical anti-natalist case that one shouldn't be bringing new life and suffering into the world. But anti-natalism isn't going to defeat the problem of suffering thanks to selection pressure, whereas I anticipate that the nature of selection pressure is going to change as the revolution in designer babies unfolds, and that increasingly prospective parents are going to be choosing the genetic makeup of their future children in anticipation of the likely psychological and behavioral effects of their choices. And this is going to result not just in the elimination of, terrible genetic diseases, but also is going to lead to a ratcheting up of hedonic range, hedonic set points, because other things being equal, most parents, almost all parents, want to have happy, healthy babies. I mean, imagine if you could choose the hedonic range, hedonic set points, pain thresholds, as well as other traits of your future kid. What dial settings would you choose? I tend to be pessimistic in the short run, but fairly optimistic in the medium to long run.
Right. Yeah. I'm a father, and I have a 6-year-old boy, and then I have I have family friends who have children who are suffering, who have there's this one girl who's got Down syndrome, and there are other kids. We can eliminate those things, through genetic editing in a way. How beautiful the world would be. So I'm going to give you an example. There's this Dr. Subhash Mukhopadhyay. He was an Indian scientist. Now he was the one who was responsible for the world's second and India's first child using in vitro fertilization. But he had to commit suicide because instead of celebrating his achievement, he was ostracized for playing God by society and the government. And so he committed suicide. So do you think this over-regulation and ethical bodies are responsible for slowing down innovation?
Oh God, it's a complicated issue. Who should ultimately be taking the decisions? Should it be medical ethics committees? Should it be prospective parents themselves? Essentially, at the moment, it is prospective parents who are doing the genetic experimentation, only they're not doing it after first studying medical genetics. They're essentially, just getting together in the time-honored way and seeing what happens. I think there does need to be regulation, but regulation informed by democratic debate, and as if we want, if we're ethically serious about the problem of suffering, we need to tackle its biological genetic roots as well as the manifold environmental causes of suffering.
Right. Yeah, I think we need to breach this subject very carefully. I mean, yeah, there is a certain section of people who are completely averse, but you know what you mentioned about super babies, and there are people, they're the ones who hold on to God. But if you noticed, ancient Indian history is full of stories that have inspired some of the top Hollywood sci-fi films. For example, the god Hanuman was a half human, half monkey god with super strength who could also fly. He was the commander of the monkey army. Now, then there was another god, Ganpati is a god, Hindu god, who was killed by his father Shiva by mistake. But he was later revived by fitting an elephant head to the child's head. So now, so he is now known as Ganesha the god, the elephant god. Hindus have 33 million gods, and most of them had multiple hands, superpower, or whatever the Hollywood movies depict now as mutants. So, do you think, I know I'm digressing, but do you think the ancient Indians kind of understood science or genetic editing and things like that?
I'm a little cautious when one hears claims that the ancients or somehow anticipated everything from quantum mechanics and quantum holism to modern genetics. I think a lot of these tales are not to be taken too literally, but nonetheless, when trying to sell the idea of civilizing our genome, of getting rid of pain and suffering and all the miseries of life, it is worth drawing on ancient ethical and religious traditions. From Gautama Buddha, may all that have life be delivered from suffering. Ahimsa, of course, harmlessness is common to all the great religions of the Indian subcontinent. Sure, there are elements of traditional religion that essentially probably you and I would describe as pure superstition. But in terms of ethical traditions of trying to do good in the world, and even the kind of the theological traditions of God or gods that are benevolent. If we are going to be, as we are, gaining these godlike powers over nature and the living world, let's at least try to be benevolent gods.
The reason I brought the gods in the conversation was because there are so many people who morally are hung up on the growth of technology, because they say that we are playing God and we need to stop this. But somehow, of my little knowledge or understanding, I feel that we are the gods, and we are getting into the world that will enable us, augment us with the qualities of what you think or who you think God was. So we are going over there, and I believe that instead of holding these bold visionary entrepreneurs, obviously there has to be regulations, but there should be a collaborative conversation where everybody is involved, and education should be created where everybody knows that this is what's happening. There is, because we are so confined and so comforted by a regular day-to-day work, we are not even looking at what's happening in the field of technology. I think that in another couple of decades, all these growing technologies will give us godlike powers, and we need to tread on that path really carefully. And that's the reason I do this podcast, to make people aware about how beautiful the world could be if we take the right choices, or how horrible the world could be if we take the wrong choice. Any last words to my listeners, and what comes up next for Mr. David Pearce?
One of the reasons I stress hedonic recalibration, gaining a higher hedonic set point, then imagine waking up tomorrow morning just in an extraordinarily good mood, but with your existing values and preferences intact. And that if we aim for a kind of global uplift in hedonic range and hedonic set tone, it's not necessary for anyone or almost anyone to give up their existing core values and preferences, that this technology is enabling. If you, you don't need to buy into anyone else's vision of the good life. If you're prepared to have your reward circuitry enhanced and that of your loved ones, essentially your default state could be of sublime well-being. And yes, I very much hope that we can get rid of all forms of involuntary suffering, because potentially, thanks to biotechnology, life could be wonderful, not just wonderful for humans, but for all sentient beings.
Lovely. That's such a profound note to end on, and we need more people like you to take the pain and suffering out of the humans and even animals. And yes, it's possible. And thank you for giving time and speaking to us and sharing insights. And to my listeners, if you like what you see in here, please press the subscribe button. Next time, see you guys. Thank you. Thank you.
Eddie, thank you very much.